The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello, my time-travelling friends. It's Sarah, the Tudor travel guide here, and I am delighted to be back with you once more and looking forward to what we are going to be talking about today. We are going to be exploring the interesting, complex, puzzling relationship between two great Tudor icons, and that is of course Queen Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. And our expert today, who's going to help us unpick the nature of that relationship and particularly what happened, or should I say didn't happen, around the intended meeting between these two queens. Now, I find that to be a particularly fascinating event. And as you will have heard in the podcast, when I was talking about the memorialisation of Mary Queen of Scots, how often we see that meeting between the two queens actually happen when, of course, we all know it didn't. But then the questions come forth, why didn't it happen? What were the factors that got in the way? What would have happened if the two queens had met? Well, I had all these questions bubbling up for me and I wanted to put them to our expert for today, and that is Professor Maria Hayward from the University of Southampton. So why don't you follow me into the conversation and hear me pose some of these questions and try to get to the bottom of the nature of the relationship between Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. So hello Maria, welcome to the Tudor History and Travel Show.
Hello, Sarah. It's lovely to see you.
It's a delight to be able to talk to you again because I haven't seen you since we recorded for the Field of Cloth of Gold 500 Virtual Summit, which, goodness me, must have been well over a year and a half ago now. We managed to get the recording in, didn't we, before the first lockdown?
Yes, absolutely. I think we were very lucky with the timing of that recording.
We so were. But we're here today to talk about a different subject, which I have just introduced to folks, and that's the relationship between Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots, and in particular this intended famous meeting which never happened. And we're going to dive into that in a moment. But for those people who don't know you, perhaps you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you work, and what your research interests are.
So my name's Maria Hayward. I'm based at the University of Southampton in the history department, and I predominantly work on the Tudor and Stuart courts with a particular interest in the stuff of early modern life. So very much the textiles, the gifts, the clothing, the horses, all of those sorts of things that made up the world that these individuals lived in.
That's wonderful. And that's what we had our conversation about, wasn't it, really, for the Field of Cloth of Gold? All the lovely glittery stuff that I love so much.
Yes.
So, Maria, we are, as I said, just talking about Elizabeth and Mary. What is your interest in these two iconic queens?
Well, I suppose it's twofold. I first really came to look at Elizabeth and Mary together as part of my special subject, which I deliver on the Tudor court. So in the first semester, I look at the three Tudor kings. And in the second semester, I started off by thinking that I would look at Elizabeth and her sister Mary, but it suddenly struck me that actually it was going to be much more interesting and representative of what queenship was as a whole was like within the British Isles, if I included Mary in this. Obviously, she's related closely to both of them, and her experiences just give us another insight into what it was like to be a queen regnant in the second half of the 16th century.
And they're such different characters, aren't they? I guess they both shed such an interesting and very different light on what, perhaps how they express their queenship.
Absolutely. So as you say, their characters are very different, but in other ways, you can see that there's a fascinating sort of competitive element between them. It almost reminds you a little of Henry VIII and Francis I, for instance, that they are similar and they experience the challenges of what it was to be a queen in a world that was ostensibly, ruled by men. But yes, their own personal experiences in many ways are quite different. Obviously, their religion divides them. I suspect that's the most sort of the largest distinguishing feature between the two of them. But then on the other hand, you look at other aspects of them, and both of them have quite complex family backgrounds and family histories and relationships with their parents, or sort of absence of parents.
Yeah, oh gosh, that would be a fascinating subject to dive deep into. It wouldn't be the psychology from the early upbringing of both of them, but maybe that's for another day. I
Yes.
know, I know when we were talking about, well, what aspect of these two queens would you most like to explore for our conversation? You really honed in on this, the topic of this intended meeting between them both. And I was just curious about why that particularly? What's so interesting to you about that particular kind of event or non-event of their reigns?
Well, several things. Firstly, this event, if it had taken place, would have been hugely significant for both of them. If you think that for a monarch, they have no equal within their own country. So in order to speak to someone who knows exactly what it is to be a crowned sovereign, you need to speak to someone outside the boundaries of your own country. And if you can do that to your own relative, and someone who's a woman like you too, then you can really see why a meeting would have been something that would have appealed to both of them. But beyond the purely sort of personal element of this, the other thing that interests me particularly about it is this whole idea of pageantry and how you use it to present a monarch to their people. And in this case, obviously, it was going to be hugely important both to the English and the Scottish courts in terms of the way the two queens' retinues interacted with each other. And for both women, of course, it's early on in their time as queen. So neither of them have been monarch for that long. And I think on the whole, with Elizabeth's reign, we don't tend to focus on the early years as much as the latter part, when she really fulfills the idea of what everybody thinks Gloriana should be like.
Well, that's a really good bridge, I think, into me asking you about this proposed meeting, because there was one that got quite close to happening, I think, and you're going to tell us all about that. So maybe you could tell us when the near meeting nearly happened, and where was it planned for, and then I guess my final question around that is, what did the Queens hope to achieve when they met face to face? Do we know?
So the meeting was planned for late summer, early autumn 1562. Specifically, it was going to be between the 20th of August and the 20th of September. It wasn't necessarily going to take up all of that time, but allowing for, travel logistics and everything else. That's why they had this month-long window within which they wanted to meet. In fact, we know that the weather was pretty bad that summer, so I imagine they probably needed some extra time to ensure that they could meet. The proposed place of meeting was York, which I think is a fascinating choice. Geographically it makes sense because it's roughly equidistant between London and Edinburgh, and obviously a substantial city in its own right. But of course, this is where Henry VIII had been due to meet James V, and of course he doesn't arrive. So there'd be some interesting sort of resonances within this city, and also of course as the sort of the heartland of the Yorkist part of the country as well. Never the most comfortable for a Tudor monarch.
So yes, I mean, I was just thinking though, I guess there would have been people who would have been in Elizabeth's retinue who would perhaps have remembered Henry's progress. I'm just trying to think of the dates. We're talking, what, 1540, aren't we, for the Henry's progress, yes. I think.
Yes. Yes.
So I guess there may have been some people, as you say, who remembered that and remembered the fact that James hadn't turned up. And there must have been some nervousness for the English on that front, wondering whether if Elizabeth did go to York, whether Mary would actually turn up.
I imagine that certainly would have been one of the issues. If you look at this from the Scottish perspective, there's that sense of whether Henry had been overly optimistic to think that James would come. You can think of quite a good few reasons why he might not have chosen to do so. But yes, I think that is always going to be one of the anxieties, isn't it? That your fellow monarch doesn't turn up and you're left sort of thumb twiddling waiting for them.
Yes, I mean the same. You mentioned the kind of the parallels between Henry and Francis, and of course there was that same tension, wasn't there, as they moved closer and closer to the field of cloth of gold. Would they turn up? And if they did turn up, was something awful going to happen? That was, it was almost, when you read the accounts, it's almost palpable.
Yes, absolutely. The potential for, a diplomatic embarrassment here is quite high. So, as you say, you would want to be absolutely certain and confident that, both monarchs would turn up. And for both countries, it's hugely important that this is a success. And certainly we can see that a certain amount of planning has gone into the visit, in advance of the point where it gets called off.
So we'll definitely come to that moment, because that is fascinating. But I was wondering a couple of things. First of all, just on the back of the comment you were just making then about, it was important to both countries that this went well. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What did each country have to gain potentially through this meeting?
Well, from the English perspective, Elizabeth and Cecil, I suspect more so, the hope is that Mary will agree to ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh. And in particular, this has already been signed by her representatives, in essence, in France. But of course, it's absolutely vital that she ratifies it. And what's particularly important is that she renounces her claim to the English throne, and she announces her wish to be seen as Mary Elizabeth's heir. So that is what Cecil is hoping to achieve here. In terms for Mary and for Scotland, I think that the aspirations are going to be slightly different. And in particular, of course, Mary is going to be wanting full recognition from Elizabeth that she is the rightful queen. And of course, she wants to be acknowledged as Elizabeth's heir. And so this is where the tension comes between them, that it's both a very personal meeting and a very politically sort of charged meeting.
Gosh, yes, I can see that, because they're almost diametrically opposed, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And in particular, of course, Elizabeth has, in theory, the possibility to take matters, she could have acknowledged Mary as her heir. But if she'd married and had a child, of course, that would have then been put out of the equation. But of course, which brings us back to the whole question of marriage and these two queens in terms of the position it puts them in.
Who initially proposed this meeting then?
That's a very good question. Once we get sort of closer to it, I think most of the emphasis comes from Mary. I think Mary has more to gain from this in many ways than Elizabeth does from that perspective, in that Elizabeth has been queen longer. She is in a slightly more settled environment, in that she is, a Protestant queen in a Protestant country, whereas Mary is a Catholic queen in a ardently, Protestant reformist country. So yes, my sense is that it comes from Mary.
obviously later on, there's the continuous stream of letters, isn't there, from Mary? I mean, obviously her
Yes.
circumstances are very different by
Yes.
the latter part of her life. At this point, she is a reigning queen, and therefore, I guess, a force to be taken seriously. But
Absolutely.
nevertheless, the impetus is still coming probably from Mary at this stage.
Yes, that is my feeling, that it is Mary that is the sort of chief mover behind this, but that ultimately, you know, once sort of Elizabeth thinks about the idea, you get the sense that, you know, she too sees real merits in the meeting, that are both personal and political. So I think we can sort of break it down into, you know, these are two women, to young women, to relatives who have never had the chance to meet. There is undeniably an aspect of curiosity, meeting each other, and obviously meeting a fellow queen regnant. So I think there's that whole element of it. But then there is also the political here, that both of them have things that they want to gain out of an encounter. And for both of them, of course, it's going to be important to be acknowledged by a fellow queen regnant. So, you know, it's politically important, personally important as well in terms of this meeting. And I think one of the things that comes out of the conversations that we see between Mary, Elizabeth and their mutual ambassadors is that the queens are invariably asking the ambassadors, you know, what's the other one like? You know, what is she beautiful? Is she tall? Is she a good musician? What's her singing voice like? You know, there is that sort of competitive edge as well to the curiosity.
It's so like Henry and Francis, isn't it? It's just a female version of it. And that's what, you know, as you're talking, that's what's coming to mind for me. Oh my goodness, if they had actually met, there would have been so much comparison going on around their feminine traits and accomplishments, I've no doubt.
Yes, absolutely. I think there'd have been a competitive dressing would definitely have,
Yeah.
and, you know, the choice of jewels and who you would have to accompany you, and, you know, both the glamour and the appeal of your retinue, the, you know, their accomplishments, all of these sorts of things, I think would have been on show. And, you know, obviously it's personal, but it's also promoting the image of your court, your country.
And so you talked before about the fact that there are actually records existing of the proposed meeting. So it was a meeting that was taken seriously and there was planning that was underway. Maybe you could tell us about what we know from those surviving records about, you know, what was in the pipeline.
So on a practical level, for instance, the mayor and aldermen of York were looking into the whole question of how do you feed all of these people? If you're envisaging that both Queen turns up with the retinue that they were allowed to, so up to 1,000 people, that would probably mean about 2,000 horses each. You know, this is a lot of mouths to feed. And so they were working on the basis that, you know, they might need, say, 1,000 loaves a day, you know, all of the different types of things. So how much bread, how much beer, how much wine, and the whole sort of victualling. So the practicalities are being considered. But also they've started to think about the entertainment. So not surprisingly, both queens liked to hunt. They both liked archery. So they're envisaging those sorts of outdoor daytime activities. But of course, one of the things that really takes a lot of planning are those evening entertainments. And we know that there is a plan for a masque, or rather a sequence of masques, that would have run over 3 consecutive nights. And on the 10th of May, Elizabeth signs a warrant for the Master of the Revels to have a large quantity of very expensive silks and linens delivered to him to make the costumes. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of detail about what those costumes might be, but you can see that in terms of acquiring these sorts of luxury goods that are difficult to source in suitable quantity, that, you know, they are thinking ahead in terms of getting this in place.
Before we go any further, if you enjoy these podcasts, did you know that you can support my work by becoming a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month? A link to find out more about this programme and the different levels of sponsorship available is included in the description associated with this podcast. And while I can't thank you in person, here's a big mwah to say a massive thank you from me. So now it's back to the show.
You know I'm a bit obsessed with Tudor places. and we know that Henry VIII stayed at the King's Manor in York. And do we have any record of where the Queens were due to stay, or has that not been recorded?
No, that's certainly one of the things that there seems to be sort of less detail on that. But I suspect that the King's Manor seems like a very likely place that they would be using, as you say. Whether they were envisaging that both queens would stay there, certainly there was a suggestion that when Henry met James, or the proposed meeting, that Henry was based, as you say, within the King's Manor, and that tents were going to be provided for James. There doesn't seem to be much sort of preparation on that sense. So unfortunately, accommodation is not one of the things that sort of appears to sort of be coming up in the documents as much.
Oh, never mind. We can imagine. And for those people who don't know, the King's Manor, or part of the King's Manor, still exists in York, isn't it? It's very fittingly part of the University of York and the Centre for Medieval Studies. So you can go to York and kind of wander around and touch a little bit of history. So that's just maybe a top tip for people who are thinking of visiting York. Now back to, you were saying that this meeting had personal and political aspects. So maybe we could just pause on the personal and dive into a little bit about what Elizabeth really felt about Mary as a woman and a queen, and maybe vice versa. Can you share your thoughts on that?
In terms of how they thought about each other, I think one of the things that's really interesting is if we look at their letters and the way they sign themselves, I think that gives us a good indication. And Mary invariably refers to herself as being Elizabeth's cousin, but more importantly, she refers to her as being her sister. And we see Elizabeth do the same. And again, I think that we can see here also a parallel between Henry and Francis, where they talk about each other as good king and brother. I think they stress that shared status through the idea of being sisters. And in that sense, you know, they are the closest in terms of being equal, in terms of their status. I think that sister expresses that bond really well. And it, by using it, it suggests a degree of closeness that sometimes we sort of lose sight of when you just see lots of political letters being exchanged between various ambassadors.
Yeah, I mean, put aside all the politics, I just think about these two women, who, as you say, were in the same situation. They were queens, you know, and they were related. There must have been an immense curiosity on each of their parts, regardless of any tension or, you know, uncertainty they might have felt. They must have been on one level dying to meet each other, even Elizabeth.
Yes, I think both of them. I get that sense that whereas I think Mary is much more open about her feelings, and you get a sense of, you know, when the ambassadors refer, say, to when Elizabeth's letters arrive, and, you know, she holds them to her chest, she tucks them into the sort of the bodice of her gown. We don't get a sense of Elizabeth necessarily doing the same, but as you say, I think there is intense curiosity, but more than that, I think there is a genuine wish to meet. As we were saying, neither of them are overly blessed with relatives. That sense of not only is this someone who's got the same status as them, but they are related, which of course is part of the trouble as well in terms of the whole question of Elizabeth's throne.
Yes, indeed. And maybe then we can move on to unpick some of the political aspects of this meeting, and particularly why it ultimately failed to take place. What are the factors that are involved in that?
Ultimately, it comes down predominantly to politics in Europe, and in particular, religious tension in France. France is essentially or exclusively a Catholic country, but it has quite a sizable reformist Huguenot element within it. Obviously, Cecil and others are keen to encourage Elizabeth to promote the Huguenot cause and support it. And when we have an incident with Mary's Guise relatives involved in sort of various run-ins with the Huguenot population, once there is an outbreak of renewed religious war in France, it becomes very clear that it isn't going to be possible for Mary and Elizabeth to meet.
So am I right then in saying it's the association of Mary's family, the Guises, and their involvement in this war with the Huguenots that creates all this tension and makes that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So in essence, it is the fact that Elizabeth is, a follower of the Reformed faith in a country which follows the same faith. Mary, of course, is a Catholic monarch in a reformed country in Scotland. And this is the big challenge here, that, for Elizabeth to be seen to meet with Mary, a Catholic, when her Catholic relatives are leading sort of military action against the Huguenot population in France. That is where the tension comes. So it's very much linked to Mary's Catholicism.
Now, there must have been, obviously, there were people around Elizabeth influencing her to not participate. Maybe you can give us a pen portrait of who those key people were.
So Cecil is, I think, the most interesting individual in this context. At the beginning, when the meeting is proposed, he is a supporter of it because he hopes it will bring about the ratification of the Treaty of Edinburgh. And if Mary relinquishes her claim to the English throne, so much the better. However, as things deteriorate in Europe, he, along with other members of the Privy Council, become very clear in the fact that Elizabeth needs to be seen to support the Huguenots in France, and meeting her Catholic cousin wouldn't be sort of compatible with that.
So do you think at the end of the day it was Cecil and the Privy Councillors who really put a stop to this? So I suppose the other, kind of the flip side of the coin of that question is if it had been left just to Elizabeth, would that meeting have gone ahead? Or do you think she would have chosen the same course of action and abandoned it?
I suspect she would have taken the same course of action, and that she would have realised that it needed to be postponed. I think one of the things that's very interesting is that when the meeting is postponed, it is only postponed. And the suggestion is that they will be able to meet in the following year in the same place, same sort of time of year. And there is obviously the hope on the part of Elizabeth and those in her council that this problem in France can be resolved in such a way that would allow Mary and Elizabeth to meet. So I think that that's what's most interesting about this, is that it isn't, as you say, it is postponed, and that they actually are sort of vaguely suggesting possible dates for that postponed visit. Once it becomes apparent that visit can't take place, then obviously it is very much sort of put on the sidelines until later in the 1560s.
Yes, and then of course things change completely for Mary, Queen of Scots. And when do you think that the idea was completely abandoned?
Well, they are still considering the possibility of a meeting in 1566 and 1567, but as you say, events happen very rapidly then for Mary, whereas at the first proposed meeting, Mary and Elizabeth would very much have been meeting as equals. By that later visit, Mary's position has changed quite radically. And now there are a whole variety of reasons why members of Elizabeth's council are really quite reticent about the idea of her meeting. And obviously, of course, once Mary comes to England, she is no longer, in the eyes of the council, a queen regnant. Obviously, Mary, of course, would have different views about the fact, obviously, that she'd been forced into abdicating her throne. Then, of course, any meeting between Elizabeth and Mary would be very, very different.
And Mary wrote countless letters, didn't she, to Elizabeth during her imprisonment, kind of beseeching Elizabeth for them to meet, but it never happened. And I was wondering, what do you think we can surmise about Elizabeth in the light of that intransigence to grant Mary, I suppose, an audience at that stage, as she was effectively a prisoner?
So once Mary is being held in England, it makes the situation much, much changed. In part, Elizabeth gets round it by not travelling anywhere near where Mary is resident, sort of to be able to sort of politely avoid the question of meeting her. But of course, in many ways, the things that made their relationship complex before haven't necessarily changed hugely, in as much as Mary is still hoping that she might be restored to her crown. James might not have agreed to that idea, but she is still hoping that it would be possible for her to recover her Scottish crown and to unite it ideally with the English crown. So it's going to make it a very complex position for Elizabeth, and because Elizabeth hasn't married, she hasn't resolved the whole question of the succession. The longer this goes on, I think the harder it's going to get for her to meet Mary. Plus, I think one of the things that's often mooted by a range of historians is that I imagine she might have been slightly disquieted by how she might respond to Mary, because I think it's one thing receiving letters, and as you say, they are passionate, highly persuasive letters that Mary sends. I think if you were to meet that person in the flesh and to then have to say, no, I am not going to help you, I'm not going to release the sort of the severity within which the constraints within which you are held, I imagine that would be very difficult to do. And so she opts for the route of denying the meeting to sort of just avoid placing herself in that difficult situation. I think it's it's in character, in other words, with a woman that used vacillation as a means of avoiding making tricky decisions in other aspects of her life.
So just moving on to a couple of slightly different questions to round off our interview today, if I may, Maria. I'm thinking, first of all, I'm fast forwarding to the end of Mary's life, where she gets involved with these plots to overthrow Elizabeth. And obviously she knew what she was doing, and she must have known that there were risks in that. And I've always wondered whether she just got to the stage where she was just fed up of being a prisoner, and she almost preferred to risk dying a martyr and, forcing Elizabeth's hand rather than just languishing in obscurity in some drafty English castle somewhere, forsaken by her own country and her own son. Do you think psychologically that's where she got to, or am I just reading too much into it?
That is a really interesting question, and one that is very, very difficult to answer. However, I don't think she ever gave up her belief in that, that she had been the rightful Queen of Scotland, and that, she was deposed. And of course, we never can get round also the fact that, Henry's decisions to declare Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate meant that for all of Catholic Europe, Mary was the legitimate monarch for the throne. Elizabeth was an illegitimate sort of usurper of that place and that role. And so I think that would have always been part of it, in terms of what kept her sort of, I suppose, what sustained her during that time of imprisonment. but yes, it's, you can imagine that, as you say, if you've been imprisoned for that long, that yes, you might feel that a reckless act is worth it, in terms of because she was being kept in increasingly unpleasant conditions. Her health was deteriorating. Yes, it's difficult.
Yeah, no, and we'll never know, of course, but
No.
interesting to muse on these things. But what you're basically saying is, that in Mary's mind, she was always the rightful queen, and that never changed. And so, the likelihood is that was the main impetus, but maybe there was a bit of an act of desperation thrown in as well.
Yes, and also I think there's an element of that, there are all of these individuals out there who are, she gets drawn into these plots. She becomes, obviously, she's the logical focal point for them. And in one sense, whether she wanted them or not, it's very difficult once these things are underway, I imagine, to extract yourself from them as well. So, but yes, this is a woman who, wasn't afraid of taking action. You get that sense during that her short reign, in Scotland, that she was probably a more active queen in terms of than Elizabeth in some respects. So.
Now, a totally different question to end off our chat today. And as I said before, the Tudor Travel Guide were totally into Tudor places here. So I wanted to ask you, what's your favourite location that's associated with Mary Queen of Scots?
Well, that is a really interesting question. And I hope that you are going to permit me a place in Scotland rather than in England.
Of course.
Choice for this being that I think, as you were saying, none of the places that she spends her time in England are those that she would associate with any happy memories, possibly, I suppose, other than her visits to Buxton to take the water for her health. But no, in terms of thinking about places, I would think that just in terms of places that I find fascinating, I would think that Loch Leven Castle is a really interesting one. To a modern visitor, it is a remarkably romantic setting, but I suspect for Mary, a place that she's imprisoned after the rebellion, after her marriage to Bothwell, and where she's held prisoner, I imagine this would not have been one that was full of happy associations for her. So I think probably in that respect, Falkland Palace is somewhere that is a particularly nice place to think about her. This is where she, in those early years of her reign, so at the time of this proposed visit, this is where she would have been holding her court, playing tennis, real tennis, riding, hunting, hawking, and so I think that is where I would choose.
Well, you've chosen two absolute beauties there, because many people will know I went to Scotland in August this year, and actually I would have put Loch Leven right at the top, just because it is just so beautiful and so romantic. And you're quite right, Falkland is such a pretty little town, and the palace, you still get a lovely sense, don't you, of the architecture and the. Yeah. It's just a beautiful scenic place. So what great choices. Good. So thank you so much, Maria, for talking to us today about Mary and Elizabeth and this meeting that never took place, and helping us unpack just why that was the case. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to me.
So that concludes this extra episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show in a week that we remember the life of Mary, Queen of Scots. I hope you have enjoyed both of the episodes that have looked at very different aspects of her life. Well, with that, we shall say goodbye for this week, and you can look out for the next Tudor History and Travel Show, Travel Essentials, which will be coming your way in a couple of weeks. And then, of course, I will be back with the main show at the beginning of March, and we will be touring the wonderful, the glorious, the romantic Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling!